She weighed over 250 pounds, squeezed into a dress that cost half her rent, sitting across from a Wall Street bro who just loudly asked if she planned on eating the entire menu. The whole restaurant went dead silent. But before the first tear could even form in her eyes, a man in a bespoke Tom Ford suit stepped out of the shadows. He didn't just kick the jerk out, he bought the entire multi-million-dollar restaurant. Penelope Gallagher knew exactly what she looked like. She was a fat woman, living in a city that worshipped the painfully thin. At 5'4" and 260 pounds, her reality was shaped by the subtle and overt judgments of Manhattan. Her curves weren't the neat, hourglass proportions celebrated on magazine covers. She had a soft, prominent belly, thick thighs that rubbed together when she walked, and upper arms that she always kept hidden under cardigans, regardless of the humidity. Tonight, however, she had tried. Her best friend, a well-meaning but hopelessly optimistic real estate agent, had set her up on a blind date. "He's in finance, Penny," her friend had chirped over the phone. "Works at Merrill Lynch. Very successful. He specifically said he likes women with substance." Penny had scoffed at the word substance, knowing it was a polite euphemism that rarely translated well in person. Still, the loneliness of a Friday night had won out. She had spent 2 hours wrestling herself into a deep emerald green wrap dress from a plus-size boutique in Brooklyn. It clung to her waist and draped over her hips, making her feel, for a fleeting second, beautiful. She paired it with sensible black heels because her weight made stilettos an agonizing form of torture, and took a yellow cab through the rain-slicked streets of Soho to Le Cuckoo. The restaurant was a cathedral of high society. Crystal chandeliers cast a dim, golden glow over velvet banquettes and pristine white tablecloths. The air smelled of truffles, expensive perfume, and old money. When Penelope approached the maitre d's stand, she immediately felt the sharp, assessing gaze of the thin, impeccably groomed hostess. "Gallagher," Penelope said, her voice tight. "Party of 2. The hostess barely disguised a flick of her eyes over Penelope's heavy frame. "Ah, yes, Mr. Bingham is not here yet. I will seat you." Penelope was led to a table in the center of the room. It was the worst possible spot, a stage where every perfectly manicured patron could observe her. For 45 minutes, she sat alone, nursing an $18 glass of sparkling water, checking her phone. Her stomach twisted into painful knots. The anxiety of taking up space, of being the fat girl sitting alone in a Michelin-starred restaurant, was suffocating. At exactly 8:15, Chadwick Bingham arrived. He looked exactly like every other mid-level finance vice president south of Canal Street. Slicked back hair, a tailored navy suit that fit a little too snugly around the shoulders, and a heavy Rolex Daytona gleaming on his wrist. He didn't apologize as he approached the table. He simply stopped, looked Penelope up and down, and let his face fall into an expression of sheer, unfiltered disgust. "You've got to be kidding me," Chad muttered, though not quietly enough. Penelope's heart dropped into her stomach. "Chadwick," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't sit down. He braced his hands on the back of the empty chair opposite her. "Stacy said you were curvy. Curvy as an hourglass, Penelope. You're—" He gestured vaguely at her midsection, his upper lip curling. "I'm not sitting down to dinner with a whale. It's bad for my image." The words cut through the ambient chatter of the restaurant like a gunshot. The couple at the next table turned to look. A waiter carrying a silver tray paused mid-stride. Penelope felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickling wave of intense humiliation. Her throat closed up, She wanted the polished hardwood floor to open and swallow her whole. "Please," Penelope whispered, clutching her napkin. "Keep your voice down." "Why?" Chad laughed, a cruel barking sound. "You think these people care? Look at you. You actually thought a guy like me would be seen eating with you. You probably planned on ordering the entire right side of the menu anyway." In a shadowed corner booth, partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement and the broad shoulders of two stone-faced men, DeAndre Castiglione set down his crystal tumbler of Macallan 25. DeAndre was not a man who concerned himself with the petty squabbles of civilians. As the head of the Castiglione family, a syndicate that controlled everything from underground casinos in Queens to commercial real estate development in Midtown, his mind was usually occupied with federal indictments, offshore accounts, and the loyalty of his capos. At 34, he possessed a lethal kind of beauty. Sharp cheekbones, pitch-black hair swept back from a patrician forehead, and eyes the color of forged steel. He radiated a quiet, terrifying stillness. He was in the middle of a delicate negotiation regarding a port contract, but the grating voice of the Merrill Lynch parasite had interrupted his thoughts. DeAndre looked past the floral arrangement. He saw the woman. She was heavily overweight, yes, wearing a green dress that brought out the red undertones in her dark hair. Her face was flushed, her dark eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. She looked devastated, completely broken, and the man towering over her was relishing every second of his cruelty. DeAndre had grown up in a world of violence, where power was taken and weakness was exploited. He had broken men's jaws for disrespecting him, but there was something deeply offensive to him about the sheer, unprovoked cowardice of humiliating a woman in public. "Rocco," DeAndre murmured. The massive man standing to DeAndre's left leaned down. "Boss?" "Cancel the port meeting. Have the associates leave through the kitchen," DeAndre said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that booked no argument. "Done," Rocco said, already tapping an earpiece. DeAndre slowly stood up. He adjusted the cuffs of his dark grey suit, revealing a glimpse of the black ink snaking around his left wrist, a stark contrast to the elegant silk of his shirt. He stepped out of the shadows, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a panther. Back at the table, Penelope was scrambling to gather her purse. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her lipstick, which rolled across the floor and stopped at the tip of a highly polished black Oxford shoe. She looked up. The man standing there was devastatingly handsome, but the aura radiating off him was pure, unadulterated danger. DeAndre reached down, picked up the gold tube of lipstick, and gently placed it on the table. He didn't look at Penelope. His steel-grey eyes were locked dead onto Chad's face. "Is there a problem here?" DeAndre asked. The volume of his voice was perfectly conversational, yet it carried an underlying threat that made the air in the room suddenly feel freezing cold. Chad puffed out his chest, oblivious to the fact that he was standing inches away from one of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard. "Mind your own business, pal. I was just leaving. My blind date here turned out to be a massive waste of my time." DeAndre tilted his head a fraction of an inch. "Apologize to her." Chad scoffed. "Excuse me? Do you know who I am? I'm a VP at—" "I don't care if you're the Pope," DeAndre interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "You have 5 seconds to apologize to this woman before I have my men drag you into the alley and break both of your legs." The silence in Le Coucou was absolute. The clinking of silver forks, the quiet jazz, the murmured conversations, all of it ceased. Penelope sat frozen, her chest heaving against the tight fabric of her dress. The man who had just spoken wasn't posturing. He wasn't puffing out his chest like a frat boy looking for a bar fight. He delivered the threat of extreme violence with the calm detachment of a man reading a grocery list. Chad's arrogant smirk faltered, but his ego wouldn't let him back down in front of an audience. "Security!" Chad barked, waving his hand frantically toward the front of the restaurant. "Hey, manager, get this psycho away from me." Monsieur Laurent, the meticulously groomed general manager, scurried over, looking pale and frantic. Laurent was a man who prided himself on knowing every VIP in Manhattan. He knew Chad Bingham as a frequent spender who brought clients in on the corporate card. But when Laurent laid eyes on DeAndre Castiglione, the manager stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained entirely from his face. Mr. Castiglione," Laurent stammered, his French accent thickening with panic. "I am so sorry. Is there an issue?" "Yes, Laurent." "There is," DeAndre said, not taking his eyes off Chad. "This piece of garbage is disturbing my dinner." Chad turned to the manager, his face red with indignation. "Laurent, throw this guy out, and her too. She's ruining the aesthetic of your establishment anyway. Look at her!" Before Chad could finish his sentence, DeAndre's hand shot out. It happened so fast, Penelope barely registered the movement. DeAndre grabbed Chad by the lapels of his expensive suit, his knuckles white, and slammed him backward into the empty chair. The wood cracked under the force. Chad gasped, the wind knocked out of him, his eyes suddenly wide with genuine terror. "Rocco, Enzo," DeAndre commanded. Two massive men in dark suits seemed to materialize out of the wood-paneled walls. They flanked Chantoni's Chad instantly. "Drag him out," DeAndre said softly. "If he opens his mouth before he hits the pavement, remove his teeth." "You can't do this!" Chad shrieked as Rocco hoisted him up by the back of his collar like a misbehaving toddler. "I'll sue you. I'll buy this restaurant and fire everyone." DeAndre pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from his inner jacket pocket. He tapped a single contact and held the phone to his ear. The entire restaurant watched in breathless silence. "Matteo, it's Dom," DeAndre said into the phone. "Who owns the building that houses Le Cuckoo?" He paused, listening. "The Sterling Group." "Good. Call them. I want the lease on the restaurant, and I want the hospitality group bought out. Now." Another pause. Penelope stared at him, her mouth slightly parted. He was buying a restaurant on a Friday night with a single phone call. "I don't care if it's past business hours. Wire the funds from the Cayman holding account. Offer them 30% above market value. Make it close in 5 minutes, or fire the lawyers." DeAndre ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He turned his gaze to the trembling general manager. "Laurent." Yes, Mr. Castiglione." "As of 60 seconds from now, I am the owner of this establishment," DeAndre stated. "Clear the room. Every patron. Give them their meals on the house, I don't care. I want this entire restaurant empty in 10 minutes. Except for her." He finally looked at Penelope. When his eyes met hers, the cold, murderous edge vanished, replaced by a strange, intense curiosity. "But sir," Laurent whispered, terrified, "we have a fully booked service." DeAndre didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Did I stutter?" Pandemonium broke out. It was a polite, high society panic, but a panic nonetheless. Waiters rushed to tables, quietly escorting bewildered billionaires, politicians, and socialites out the front door. Rocco and Enzo had already dragged a thrashing, hyperventilating Chad out through the service exit. Penelope sat at her table, the green fabric of her dress suddenly feeling like lead. She felt utterly exposed, a massive, heavy stone sitting in the middle of a rushing river. She watched as the restaurant emptied out around her, the clatter of departing guests echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She needed to leave. She was fat, she was humiliated, and she was clearly in the presence of a mafia boss. She grabbed her purse and pushed herself up, her thighs pressing against the heavy mahogany table. "Sit down," a voice said. It wasn't a request. Penelope looked up. DeAndre was standing across from her, resting his hands on the back of the chair Chad had occupied moments before. I should go," Penelope stammered. Her voice was raspy, thick with unshed tears. "Thank you for what you did. You didn't have to." "Sit down, Penelope," DeAndre repeated, his tone softening just a fraction, though the command remained. She blinked. "How do you know my name?" "The idiot screamed it loudly enough for the entire borough to hear," DeAndre replied, pulling out the chair and sitting down opposite her. He snapped his fingers without looking away from her face. Immediately, a waiter appeared, trembling slightly, holding a fresh bottle of vintage Dom Perignon. He poured 2 glasses, set them down, and vanished back into the shadows. The restaurant was now entirely empty. The quiet jazz music had stopped. The only sound was the rain beating against the massive front windows of the building. Dozens of empty tables surrounded them, a surreal private dining room purchased for millions of dollars on a whim. Penelope slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Her hands were still shaking. She looked at the champagne, then at the man sitting across from her. Up close, he was terrifying. There was a faint, jagged scar running along his jawline, and the sheer breadth of his shoulders seemed to block out the light behind him. "You bought a restaurant," Penelope stated, the absurdity of the situation finally overriding her embarrassment. "I made an investment," DeAndre corrected smoothly. He picked up his champagne flute. "Drink." "I don't drink with mobsters," she blurted out. The moment the words left her mouth, Penelope wanted to die. She slapped a hand over her mouth. Her mother had always warned her that her lack of a filter would get her into trouble. She fully expected him to summon his goons to drag her out next. Instead, DeAndre Castiglione threw his head back and let out a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. It was a genuine sound, rich and dark. "Not many people would have the spine to say that to my face, Penelope," he said, leaning forward, bracing his forearms on the table. "Especially not after I just bought a building to secure their dinner reservation." "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down at her lap, suddenly acutely aware of how her stomach pressed against the table edge. She tried to suck it in, a reflex born of years of insecurity. I'm a mess tonight. I'm fat. I'm wearing a dress that's cutting off my circulation. And I was just publicly humiliated by a man who looked like an extra from The Wolf of Wall Street. I just want to go home to my cat." DeAndre's eyes darkened, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Stop apologizing," he commanded softly, "and stop insulting yourself. The man was a fool. You are not." For the next 2 hours, Penelope found herself trapped in the most surreal experience of her life. The kitchen staff, clearly terrified of their new owner, pulled out every stop. Course after course of culinary masterpieces was brought to their table. There were oysters with caviar, seared foie gras with fig compote, butter-poached lobster, and a rich, decadent Wagyu beef that melted on the tongue. At first, Penelope picked at her food. Eating in front of a man, especially an incredibly attractive one, had always been a source of deep anxiety for her. Society told heavy women They shouldn't be seen enjoying food. She was acutely aware of her double chin when she chewed, the way her thick arms rested on the table. But DeAndre didn't look at her with the clinical, judgmental gaze she was so used to. He watched her with a predatory, quiet fascination. He ate his own meal methodically, keeping the conversation flowing. She learned that his business, the legitimate side of it anyway, was Aegis Global Logistics. She told him about her job as a digital security auditor at Bexley and Shaw, expecting his eyes to glaze over. Instead, he asked pointed, highly technical questions about encryption protocols and firewall vulnerabilities. "You track hidden money," DeAndre said, taking a sip of his wine. "I track digital anomalies," Penelope corrected, wiping her mouth with a linen napkin. "People who think they can hide millions in shell companies usually leave a digital footprint. A sloppy one. I just find the footprints." DeAndre smiled, a slow, dangerous curving of his lips. "I'll have to make sure my accountants are never audited by you, Miss Gallagher." Penelope felt a sudden flush of heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the way he said her name. "Why did you do it?" she asked, setting down her fork. The Wagyu was gone. She had eaten the whole thing, abandoning her self-imposed diet rules in the face of Michelin-starred perfection. "Why did you intervene? Guys like you don't play white knight for overweight data analysts." DeAndre sat back in his chair. The shadows of the restaurant seemed to cling to him. "Guys like me?" "Dangerous men," she said plainly. She wasn't an idiot. The tattoos, the armed guards at the doors, the casual multi-million-dollar purchase. "You command an army. You ruin lives for a living. Why save my dignity?" He stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. "Because cruelty offends me," DeAndre finally said, his voice quiet. "Violence is a tool. It has a purpose. What that maggot did to you was pointless. It was the act of a weak man trying to feel strong by tearing down a woman who possesses 10 times his worth." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the curves of her chest, then back to her eyes. "And for the record, I prefer women who look like they actually enjoy being alive. You are beautiful, Penelope. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either blind or intimidated." Penelope's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her heavy frame and seen power instead of gluttony. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, it was nearly midnight. The storm outside had worsened, rain lashing fiercely against the glass. "I should get you home," DeAndre said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "I can call an Uber," Penelope protested instinctively, reaching for her phone. DeAndre gave her a flat look. "Don't insult me. My car is waiting." He escorted her out the front doors. Monsieur Laurent stood by the exit, bowing profusely, though he refused to make eye contact with DeAndre. Outside, idling by the curb in the pouring rain, was a massive armor-plated Mercedes-Maybach. Rocco stood by the open rear door, holding a large black umbrella. DeAndre placed a hand on the small of Penelope's back to guide her. His hand was enormous, his heat radiating through the damp fabric of her green dress. She shivered. They slid into the back of the Maybach. The interior was a cavern of dark leather and soundproofing. As soon as the heavy doors slammed shut, the noise of the city was completely eradicated. "Where to?" DeAndre asked. "Park Slope." "Brooklyn," she replied softly. He gave a sharp nod to the driver, and the massive vehicle, glided smoothly into the traffic on West Broadway. Penelope leaned her head against the cool glass, watching the neon lights of Manhattan streak by in blurred lines. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and buzzing with an adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. She glanced sideways at DeAndre. He was checking his phone, the blue light illuminating his sharp features. But out the rear window, Penelope noticed something else. Through the sheets of rain, a pair of headlights stayed perfectly consistent behind them. Two black SUVs, dark and aggressive, maintaining an exact, measured distance. Penelope, trained to notice patterns and anomalies, frowned. DeAndre? Yes? He didn't look up from his screen. Are your men in those cars behind us? DeAndre's head snapped up. In a fraction of a second, the calm, collected businessman vanished, replaced entirely by the ruthless cartel boss. He twisted in his seat, looking out the rear window. Up front, the driver's voice cracked over the intercom. Boss, we've got company. The Moretti family. They tracked us from the restaurant. DeAndre cursed violently in Italian, pulling a heavy, matte black Glock 19 from a holster concealed beneath his jacket. Rocco, DeAndre barked into the intercom. Evasive maneuvers. Lose them before the bridge. Call Enzo. Tell him to block the intersection. Penelope gasped, pressing her heavy body back into the plush leather seats. Her heart was in her throat. DeAndre turned to her, his steel gray eyes blazing with lethal intent. He reached out, grabbing her upper arm in a grip that was firm but protective, pulling her down toward his chest. Keep your head down, Penelope, he ordered, his voice dangerously calm. Your blind date is officially over. The heavy, armor-plated Mercedes Maybach lurched forward with a guttural roar, the V12 engine throwing Penelope back against the leather seats. The sudden G-force made her stomach drop. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, blurring the streetlights into violent streaks of yellow and red. Get us onto the Manhattan Bridge, now! DeAndre roared over the chaos. He didn't let go of Penelope. His left arm was wrapped securely around her thick waist, pressing her face into the lapel of his Tom Ford suit. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, her heavy breaths hitching in her chest as the luxury sedan violently swerved to avoid a yellow taxi. Behind them, the sharp crack, crack, crack of automatic gunfire echoed through the night. Down, DeAndre commanded, forcing her lower until she was practically entirely shielded by his broad body. A barrage of bullets struck the rear windshield. The specialized ballistic glass held, but horrific, spiderweb fractures bloomed across the surface. Penelope clamped her hands over her ears, a terrified sob escaping her lips. She felt absurdly large and clumsy in the cramped space of the floorboards, her green wrap dress twisted around her thighs. She felt like a liability, a massive, cumbersome target that DeAndre now had to drag through a war zone. Rocco, brake check the lead car, DeAndre yelled into the intercom. The Maybach's tires shrieked in protest as Rocco slammed on the brakes. The massive vehicle shuddered. A deafening crunch of metal on metal followed as the first Moretti SUV slammed into their reinforced rear bumper. Before the pursuing driver could recover, Rocco slammed the accelerator, sending the Maybach rocketing up the ramp onto the Manhattan Bridge. Enzo, DeAndre barked into his phone, keeping his voice eerily steady despite the chaos. I want a barricade at the Brooklyn side exit of the bridge, Flatbush Avenue extension. The Morettis have a black Cadillac Escalade left. Do not let it pass. Penelope peeked over the edge of the seat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Through the fractured rear window, she saw the remaining escalade gaining on them. They were tearing across the bridge at 90 miles an hour, swerving violently between late-night commuters. "DeAndre!" Penelope gasped, clutching his forearm. "They're right behind us." "Look at me," DeAndre said, grabbing her chin and forcing her gaze away from the glass. His steel-grey eyes were devoid of panic. They were completely calm, anchored in absolute certainty. "I am not going to let anything happen to you. Do you understand?" She could only manage a frantic nod. As they crested the bridge and began the descent into Brooklyn, a pair of dark, unmarked sedans suddenly pulled out from a side street, violently blocking the Flatbush exit. It was Enzo's crew. The pursuing Escalade tried to swerve, but the wet asphalt offered no traction. The massive SUV spun out of control, slamming brutally into the concrete median with a shower of sparks and shattered glass. "We're clear, boss," Rocco's voice came over the intercom, tight but relieved. "Take us to the clock tower penthouse," DeAndre ordered, finally holstering his weapon. He slowly pulled Penelope up from the floorboards, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her back onto the seat. 20 minutes later, they pulled into a heavily fortified underground garage beneath one of the most exclusive residential buildings in Dumbo. The adrenaline that had been keeping Penelope upright suddenly evaporated. When the car door opened, her legs turned to jelly. She stumbled, her 260 pounds pitching forward toward the concrete floor. DeAndre caught her effortlessly. He didn't stumble under her weight. He simply locked his arm around her waist and hoisted her up. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I can't walk," she whispered, humiliating tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I'm too heavy. My legs just won't work." "You are exactly as you should be," DeAndre said fiercely. To her absolute shock, he slid one arm under her knees and lifted her entirely off the ground. Penelope gasped, instinctively wrapping her thick arms around his neck. Men didn't carry her. She was a fat woman. She had spent her entire adult life making sure she never had to rely on anyone's physical strength but her own. Yet, DeAndre carried her toward the private elevator without a single grunt of exertion, his face a mask of fierce, protective determination. The penthouse was a sprawling fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and dark leather furniture, offering a panoramic, multi-million-dollar view of the Brooklyn Bridge. Armed guards stood by the private elevator bank, nodding silently as DeAndre carried her past them. He set her down gently on a massive, low-profile velvet sofa in the center of the living room. He walked over to a wet bar, poured a generous measure of Macallan into a crystal tumbler, and handed it to her. "Drink. It helps with the shock." Penelope took a shaky sip, the amber liquid burning a trail of fire down her throat. She looked down at her ruined dress, the hem torn, covered in dust from the floorboards of the car. "What just happened? Why were they shooting at you?" "The Moretti family and mine have been in a territorial dispute over port logistics," DeAndre said, shedding his suit jacket and unbuttoning the top of his silk shirt. The dark ink of his tattoos peeked out from the collar. "They tracked me from Lukuku. They saw an opportunity and took it." He knelt in front of her, his gaze intense. "I dragged you into a crossfire, Penelope. I apologize." "You bought a restaurant to save me from a bad date," she managed a weak, exhausted smile. "I guess we're even." He didn't smile back. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'm keeping you here tonight. It isn't safe for you to go back to your apartment until I have my men sweep the area. My cat..." "Rocco already dispatched someone to feed the cat and retrieve your essentials," DeAndre interrupted smoothly. "Get some sleep. You are safe here." The morning sun over the East River was blindingly bright, pouring through the massive windows of the penthouse. Penelope woke up on a California king bed, swathed in high thread-count Egyptian cotton. She was wearing a black silk button-down shirt that she had found draped over the foot of the bed. It clearly belonged to DeAndre, the sheer size of it comfortably draped over her wide hips and large bust, falling to her mid-thigh like a luxurious nightgown. For a brief, delirious moment, she forgot about the gunfire and the adrenaline. She just felt warm and surprisingly sexy. Then reality crashed back in. She padded barefoot out of the bedroom, her thick thighs brushing against the cool hardwood floor. The scent of freshly brewed espresso led her toward the sprawling kitchen. DeAndre was sitting at a massive marble island, a laptop open in front of him. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a tight grey Henley that clung to the muscular expanse of his chest. Next to him stood a pale, wiry man with thick glasses, rapidly typing on a tablet. "Good morning," DeAndre said, his eyes immediately lifting from the screen to lock onto her. His gaze drifted slowly over the silk shirt, a flash of undeniable hunger darkening his grey eyes before he reined it in. "Coffee is in the carafe." "Thank you," Penelope murmured, pouring herself a cup. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, suddenly feeling incredibly self-conscious of her bare legs and messy hair. "Penelope, this is Leo. He handles my digital infrastructure," DeAndre said, gesturing to the wiry man. "Sit down. We have a problem." Penelope pulled up a heavy bar stool, her stomach twisting into a familiar knot of anxiety. "Did the Morettis find us?" "No," DeAndre said, leaning forward. "Leo spent the night digging into the tracking software the Morettis used to follow my car. They didn't ping my phone. They didn't ping Rocco's." Penelope frowned, the analytical part of her brain clicking into gear. Then how did they know where the Maybach was? Leo adjusted his glasses and turned the tablet toward her. "They didn't track the car, Miss Gallagher. They tracked you." Penelope froze. The coffee mug in her hand trembled. "What? That's impossible. Why would the Mafia track a digital security auditor? Tell me exactly what you've been working on at Bexley and Shaw for the past 2 weeks, DeAndre demanded, his voice low and urgent. Penelope swallowed hard. "Just routine corporate audits. I flagged a series of irregularities in a client's offshore portfolio. Millions of dollars moving through dummy corporations in the Caymans. Standard shell company laundering. I compiled the report and sent it to my supervisor on Wednesday. And who was the financial institution managing those dummy corporations?" DeAndre asked. Penelope closed her eyes, trying to recall the endless spreadsheets. It was an investment bank. Merrill Lynch. The silence in the penthouse was sudden and deafening. DeAndre stood up, his jaw clenched so tightly the scar on his cheek stood out in stark relief. He began pacing the length of the kitchen, radiating a terrifying, violent energy. "Chadwick Bingham," Penelope whispered, the horrific realization hitting her like a freight train. "My blind date. He works at Merrill Lynch." "Chadwick Bingham is not just a Wall Street bro," DeAndre snarled, his voice vibrating with lethal fury. "He's a mid-level cleaner for the Moretti family. He manages their dirty money." Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. "Stacy, my friend Stacy set us up. She said he specifically asked for me. He manipulated your friend to get you out of your apartment," DeAndre explained, stopping to slam his hands flat on the marble island. "He took you to a highly public place to establish an alibi, and he planned to walk out on you. Once you left the restaurant alone, broken and crying, the Moretti men waiting outside would have snatched you off the street. Penelope covered her mouth, a wave of profound nausea washing over her. They wanted to kidnap me. Because of my audit? They wanted to force you to erase the digital footprints you found, and then they were going to kill you, DeAndre stated brutally, refusing to sugarcoat the reality. When I intervened at Le Coucou and bought the building, I ruined their quiet extraction. I embarrassed Bingham, and I put you in my protected vehicle. The drive-by shooting wasn't a hit on me. It was a desperate, sloppy attempt to take you out before you could hand that audit over to the feds. Oh my God, Penelope sobbed, tears finally breaking free. She hugged her heavy arms tightly across her chest, feeling completely exposed and terrified. I'm just an auditor. I live alone. I have a cat. I can't do this. In 2 long strides, DeAndre was around the kitchen island. He pulled her up from the bar stool and crushed her against his chest. His embrace was unyielding, completely engulfing her soft, heavy frame in his hard, muscular warmth. Listen to me, DeAndre said, pressing his lips to the crown of her head. They underestimated you. They thought you were just a lonely, insecure woman they could bully and manipulate. But they didn't know you had me. Penelope looked up at him, her dark eyes swimming with tears. Why are you doing this? Why do you care? You could just let me go. I am a man who protects what belongs to him, DeAndre growled, his voice raw with a possessive edge that sent a shiver down her spine. From the second I stepped out of the shadows in that restaurant, your life became intertwined with mine. The Morettis have declared war by targeting a civilian in my territory. I will burn their entire syndicate to the ground before I let them touch a single hair on your head. He pulled back slightly, his intense gaze dropping to her lips. And besides, you are the only woman who has ever had the audacity to tell me to my face that you don't drink with mobsters. I'm not losing you. Before Penelope could process the intoxicating weight of his words, Leo cleared his throat awkwardly from across the room. Boss, Leo said, tapping his earpiece, I just intercepted an encrypted message from the Moretti camp. They didn't just guess that you were taking Penelope to this safe house. DeAndre's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Explain. The hitmen knew the exact route Rocco was going to take off the bridge, Leo said, his face pale. Someone inside our organization fed them our tactical extraction plans. We have a mole, boss, and they are inside the family. The word mole hung in the air of the sprawling Dumbo penthouse like a live grenade. The absolute sanctity of the Castiglione family had been breached. DeAndre's eyes went dead, a terrifying flat black that promised absolute ruin. Penelope didn't panic. While the violence of the mafia world terrified her, digital warfare was a landscape she understood intimately. It was a world of logic, codes, and vulnerabilities. Let me see the logs, Penelope said, her voice surprisingly steady. Leo blinked, looking at DeAndre for permission. DeAndre gave a single, sharp nod. Penelope slid onto the leather chair in front of the multi-monitor setup. She felt the cool silk of DeAndre's shirt slide across her heavy thighs as she leaned forward, her fingers flying over the mechanical keyboard. The encrypted message Leo intercepted, Penelope murmured, her eyes scanning lines of rapidly scrolling code. It was sent over a secure Tor network, but they made a rookie mistake. They used a persistent node to route the data. If I run a packet sniffer and trace the handshake protocols back through the internal server, for the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the penthouse was the frantic clacking of keys. DeAndre stood directly behind her, his large hands resting possessively on her shoulders. His thumbs rubbed soothing circles into her collarbones, a grounding, physical presence that kept her anxiety at bay. He wasn't looking at her waistline or judging the soft roll of her stomach where she leaned against the desk. He was watching her mind at work, utterly captivated by her brilliance. "Got it," Penelope breathed, hitting the final execution command. A map of Manhattan flashed onto the center screen, a red dot pulsing over a high-rise in the financial district. The internal leak didn't come from a burner phone. It came from an authorized device running AES 256 encryption, specifically a device registered to the IP address of your corporate headquarters at Aegis Global Logistics. Leo's face drained of blood. "That's the executive floor." "Who?" DeAndre demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Penelope brought up the final node registry. "The device is registered to Matteo Lombardi." DeAndre's hands tightened on her shoulders for a fraction of a second before he let go. Matteo, the man DeAndre had called from Le Cuckoo to buy the restaurant. His underboss, his trusted financial architect. "Matteo handles the legitimate laundering," DeAndre said, pacing away from the monitors, his mind moving like a chess grandmaster. "He's been losing money on the offshore accounts. The Morettis must have found out, squeezed him, and offered to cover his debts in exchange for handing over my logistics routes. When I bought Le Cuckoo and disrupted the hit on you, Matteo panicked. He fed them our escape route off the bridge to finish the job." "What do we do?" Rocco asked, unholstering his weapon, his massive frame vibrating with the need for violence. "We give them exactly what they want," DeAndre said, a cruel, predatory smile curving his lips. He turned to Penelope. "Can you spoof Matteo's device? Send a message to the Morettis that looks like it came from him." Penelope nodded confidently. "Easily." "Good," DeAndre commanded. "Send a ping to the Moretti boss. Tell them DeAndre Castiglione is moving the girl to a private hangar at Teterboro Airport in 2 hours. Tell them I'll be traveling light, just Rocco and myself." "You're walking into a trap," Penelope gasped, spinning the chair around. Her heart hammered against her ribs. DeAndre knelt in front of her again, trapping her thick thighs between his knees. He looked up into her dark, terrified eyes. "No, Mia Bella. I am building a cage, and I am going to lock the animals inside." By nightfall, the air over New Jersey was thick with humidity and the smell of jet fuel. Penelope was locked safely inside the reinforced panic room back at the penthouse, watching the events unfold via a secured satellite feed Leo had patched into the monitors. At Hangar 4 of Teterboro Airport, a sleek Gulfstream G650 sat idling on the tarmac. DeAndre and Rocco stood by the boarding stairs, illuminated by the harsh glare of the halogen floodlights. DeAndre looked perfectly at ease in a bespoke black suit, checking his heavy Patek Philippe watch. Right on time, the perimeter fence alarm was breached. 3 black SUVs tore onto the tarmac, their tires shrieking as they slammed to a halt, completely boxing in the private jet. A dozen heavily armed Moretti soldiers poured out, weapons raised. From the lead vehicle stepped 2 men. One was an older man with silver hair and a tailored overcoat. Don Moretti himself, lured out by the prospect of taking down the head of the Castiglione family. The second man made Penelope's blood boil even through the screen. It was Chadwick Bingham. The Wall Street bro was wearing a tactical vest over his suit, looking nervously around, desperate to play the part of a hardened criminal. "DeAndre!" Don Moretti shouted over the whine of the jet engines, stepping forward. "You've gone soft, playing knight in shining armor for some fat accountant. Hand over the girl and the auditing files, and I might let you keep your territory in Queens." DeAndre didn't draw his weapon. He merely slipped his hands into his pockets and laughed. It was a cold, echoing sound that sent shivers down Penelope's spine miles away. "You brought a Wall Street errand boy to a gunfight, Moretti," DeAndre mocked, his eyes locking onto Chad. "And you stepped onto my tarmac without asking." "You're outnumbered, Castiglione," Chad shouted, his voice cracking slightly with fake bravado. "She's just a whale who got lucky. Give her up, or we put you in the ground." "Now, Rocco," DeAndre murmured. The trap sprang with terrifying precision. The hangar doors behind the Moretti crew suddenly rolled open with a deafening screech. 2 armored tactical vehicles roared out, blinding the hitmen with high-intensity floodlights. At the same time, the doors of the idling Gulf Stream swung open, and 20 heavily armed Castiglione enforcers filed out, tactical rifles trained perfectly on the Moretti men. Snipers, hidden on the roof of the adjacent hangars, fired warning shots that shattered the engine blocks of the Moretti SUVs, instantly disabling their escape routes. In less than 5 seconds, the ambush was absolute. The Moretti soldiers, realizing they were completely outgunned and outmaneuvered, dropped their weapons, kicking them across the wet tarmac. Don Moretti's face contorted in rage and sudden, absolute fear. He fell to his knees as Rocco stepped forward, pressing the barrel of an assault rifle directly against the old man's forehead. But DeAndre didn't look at the rival boss. He walked slowly, methodically, toward Chadwick Bingham. Chad's arrogant facade shattered instantly. He stumbled backward, his dress shoes slipping on the oily tarmac. He fell hard onto his hands and knees, scrambling desperately backward until his back hit the tire of a ruined SUV. DeAndre towered over him, a dark, avenging god bathed in the harsh halogen light. "Please," Chad sobbed, holding his hands up, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Castiglione. I'm just a banker. I just launder the money. I didn't want to kill her, I swear." "You humiliated the woman I love in front of a room full of people," DeAndre said, his voice deadly quiet, carrying easily over the wind. Back in the penthouse panic room, Penelope gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. "The woman I love." DeAndre grabbed Chad by the tactical vest and hauled him to his feet with one hand, slamming him violently against the side of the vehicle. "You called her a whale. You looked at a queen and treated her like dirt because your own soul is so pathetically small. I bought that restaurant to save her from you. I bought this airport to bury you." "I'll give you everything," Chad wailed, his pants visibly dampening. "The account numbers, the routing codes, Mateo's offshore drops. Just let me live." DeAndre stared at him with pure disgust. "You will give my men every digital code you possess, and then you are going to disappear if I ever hear your name again. If you ever step foot in New York City, or if you even look at a woman with an ounce of disrespect, Rocco will feed you to the stray dogs in the Bronx. Do we have an understanding?" Chad nodded frantically, sobbing uncontrollably. DeAndre dropped him. He turned his back on the pathetic man and looked toward Rocco. "Clean this up. Take Moretti to the basement of the St. Regis property. We have a lot to discuss about his early retirement." DeAndre turned and walked toward the waiting armored Maybach that had just pulled onto the tarmac. His work here was done. It was time to go home. When DeAndre stepped out of the private elevator and into the Dumbo penthouse, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a bruised purple light over the Brooklyn Bridge. Penelope was waiting for him in the center of the living room. She had showered and put on one of his thick, dark gray cashmere sweaters, which hung off her shoulders and draped elegantly over her full hips. Her dark hair was damp, framing her flushed face. She looked soft, beautiful, and completely breathtaking. DeAndre stopped in his tracks, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her vanilla soap. "It's over," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion and raw emotion. "Matteo is handled. The Morettis are broken. Bingham will never see the light of day as a free man again." Penelope wrapped her thick arms around his waist, holding him just as tightly. "I heard you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "On the monitors. What you said to him." DeAndre pulled back slightly, framing her beautiful full face with his large hands. His steel-grey eyes were intense, burning with an absolute possessive flamme. "I meant every word. I have spent my entire life in the dark, Penelope, ruling by fear, surrounded by violence. Then I saw you sitting in Lukuku, wearing that green dress, trying so hard to shrink yourself for a world that doesn't deserve you." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. "DeAndre, I'm not the kind of girl men like you go for. I'm heavy. I take up space." "You take up exactly the amount of space my heart needs," DeAndre interrupted fiercely. He brushed his thumb over her bottom lip. "I don't want a fragile, empty shell of a woman. I want you. I want your brilliant mind that outsmarted my entire digital security team. I want your curves, your softness, your fire. You are an absolute goddess, Penelope. And from this night forward, you are mine." He didn't give her a chance to argue. He crashed his lips down onto hers, kissing her with a fierce, demanding passion that stole the breath from her lungs. Penelope melted into him, rising on her tiptoes, finally letting go of the lifetime of insecurities that had weighed her down. She was fat, she was brilliant, and she was loved by the most dangerous man in the city. DeAndre swept her off her feet, carrying her weight effortlessly as he walked them toward the master bedroom. The empire was secure, the enemies were vanquished. But as he laid her gently on the silk sheets, DeAndre knew his greatest victory was the woman in his arms. Did this mafia romance make your heart race? If you loved watching Penelope own her worth and DeAndre destroy anyone who disrespected his queen, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a powerful, protective mafia boss and a curvy, brilliant heroine who saves the day. Want more intense, high-stakes romance stories where the bad boys fall hard? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single dramatic twist. Stay tuned for the next upload.